Oh, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly from beautiful Danville, Illinois. And I want to welcome you to Midday with Reverend Don. And I hope you're having a lovely day, and I thank you for spending this time with me. And we will see where the conversation takes us. Um, And if you would like to be part of that conversation, you can type in your comments or questions on whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they should show up in my chat room and we can interact directly. And I think I want to start by referencing the announcement from last evening. Pagan World TV is looking for people to do talk shows and also to do spell segments. With the idea of making the daily spell literally about spells. So this is something that I want to encourage you, if you have any interest at all, to consider pursuing. The information for how to do that is right here on the screen, and you can contact the email given or the direct message and set something up if you have an interest in doing that. So today I want to talk about, well, first, oh, hello to Uncle Birch in the chat room. Good to see you, Uncle Birch. And Uncle Birch says, Uncle Don, yay. Although I think I've come to the point in life I'm thinking of myself as Grandpapa Don, but yes, um, it's interesting to be growing older when you always had a high capacity for age. But you know, as they say, it's a privilege denied to many. And hello to Janet in the chat room. Good to see you, Janet. Good to see you, Uncle Birch. Thank you for spending this time with me. I was just talking with an old friend about some of the things that I'm doing, so I'm going to go straight into that. One of the big things I'm doing is my Patreon, which you can find at revdonlewis.com. And my Patreon includes things like my weekly chat room, which has been going since 1998, which has been an adventure over all those years. It's been on so many different platforms, spent most of that time at witchschool.com, but in different incarnations. We tried a 3D chat room for a while that gave everyone vertigo. But when the video option came, the option to do it from Zoom, it became much more immediate, much more, for me at least, more enjoyable to actually get to actually see the people I'm interacting with and talk directly. So every Monday night we do that with members of my Patreon. There's also a monthly newsletter. The first one will be coming out presently. There is a monthly seminar. The first one will be on June 24th. There is a monthly surprise. And I'm not going to tell you when that's coming or what it is, but it's on its way. And these are all things I'm offering through my Patreon, and more may come. Also, of course, working with CorellianPublishing.com. This morning I was talking about Reverend Don's super omnibus of magical incantations and invocations for all occasions. We have a few of the collectible copies still left. These are hardback copies that are signed, dated, and numbered. Only 125 were produced. There's still a few left if you would like one. And of course, there are also the paperback copy is available. And we have numerous other books at CorellianPublishing.com, including our degree books, Medium 365, and other offerings. And I'm looking at volume 3 of Reverend Don's Book of Questions within a matter of days. And if you're not familiar with Reverend Don's Book of Questions, the books of questions each contain 100 questions from Reverend Don's vlog. And Janet says, I have this one, yay. Reverend Don's vlog I did for 10 years. It started as a daily vlog, not unlike this broadcast, but a different format. a little shorter. And I did it for a solid decade, although it went from daily to finally like 4 days a week. But what I mostly did during that time was take questions from viewers. And because they were viewers' questions, they covered every subject in the metaphysical world you can think of. It was a wonderful experience. And of course, in the vlog, I also did other things besides questions, including sometimes interviews and other presentations, but questions was the main thing. And in Rev Don's book of questions, each one takes 100 of those questions and gives you the question and the answer in black and white. And you know, we had questions about the nature of the universe, the nature of the soul, incarnation. We had questions that had to do with the nature of the community and the politics of the community, with education, with all aspects of magic. It was fascinating to do, and I think you would find it fascinating to read. So that is coming. Book number 3. There are 4 altogether. We chose the 400 most compelling questions, and that will be coming soon. And you know, I have to say, one of the greatest compliments I ever received was in relationship to the vlog. And hello to Cheryl May in the chat room. Good to see you, Cheryl May. One of the best compliments was that I would take anyone's question and give it a good answer. And I like to think that was true. I did not treat the questions flippantly, which I know some people might have chosen to do, but I felt that was not the thing, but rather to speak directly and honestly to all of them, regardless of what they were. Because some of the questions obviously came from people who did not have a background in the subject and would probably not have asked that question or would have asked a different question if they did have a background in the subject. But, I mean, who needs information more than those who don't have that background? And so, even if it was a question that perhaps seemed very simple to me, I always made it a point to give it a real answer. And I think the only thing I ever said could not be done was turning yourself into a mermaid. I don't know how you would do that one. But, you know, most things, even if it was something that a lot of people would have said that to, that's not the answer I made. For example, I remember getting a question about fireballs and throwing fireballs. And some people would have said, well, that's just Hollywood. But it isn't. We practice this astrally. We use energy in such a way that it can be thrown as a fireball, but you're not going to see it like you would in an animation. There was another question. There was a question about changing your eye color, like in the movie The Craft. And of course, you can't physically do that necessarily, although I'm not entirely sure how much money I want to place on that bet, but I've not seen someone do it physically in that way, although some of us do have eyes that do change color. And if you happen to have that trait, then it's another question. But the answer to that is, well, yes, we can practice something called a glamour. And I talked about practicing glamours and how people do use magic to change the perception of their appearance. It's not like in the movie The Craft, but it can be perceived that way. It actually is a real thing. And there were other questions like that, things that many people would have dismissed because they didn't stop necessarily to think about it. But if you think about it, some questions that perhaps seemed extreme or outlandish really were not. It was only a shift in terminology, a shift in how you look at it, that was necessary to make the proper answer. And one of the questions I sometimes reference, oh, and hello to Fluffy in the chat room. Fluffy says that their eyes go from green to gold on occasion. And yes, exactly so. Mine have gone all the way from blue to brown on occasion. And you can even see it in video. I knew a lady once who, in daily life, her eyes were brown, but they would change And she said that for her, it had to do with physical activity. If she was exhausted, her eyes would lighten, and that they could go as light as sky blue if she was extremely exhausted. I think for most people who have, I've always understood the term as hazel eyes, eyes that change, that it can have to do with a number of factors, including emotion, the mood that you're in, um, exhaustion as referenced. Hello to Deb in the chat room. Good to see you, Deb. And they definitely can do that. Most people don't, but some people do. And if it happens, then yes, I think you can bring conscious control to that if you think it's worth it. I don't know that I do, but the real answer to the question was yes, we use glamours that can change how your appearance is perceived. Hello to Brian in the chat room, and congratulations on your elevation to first degree, Brian. I was very glad to see that this morning. So there were a lot of interesting questions. One of the more interesting questions that I remember when Kenny Rogers died, after Fove, who was a serial questioner, had the question if it was really true that you had to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, and the rest of that stanza. And I took that as an occasion to speak on the idea of picking your fights, picking your battles. And yes, you do you do need to know when to hold them and when to fold them. It makes a huge difference. And a lot of people don't have a sense of perspective on when they need to fight and when they don't. And so they'll squander their energy on small things. And when something big comes, they don't have it. Whereas if you pick your battles, you'll have your energy when you need it. Hello to Sarah in the chat room. Good to see you, Sarah. And these are some of the questions that we spoke to, as well as many other quite intentionally metaphysical questions. There were a lot of questions on things like parallel lives, probabilities, the nature of incarnation, the ethics of magic, although personally I prefer the term morals. I've always had an issue with that term ethics because I think people use it in a far less serious way. But whatever you call it, the issues are the same. And one of the things we often talked about was the Wiccan Rede and what it means, certainly from a Corellian perspective, which is my background, which is a very particular perspective. And not everyone sees it that way. And I always tried to point out that the answers I was giving were from my perspective, and sometimes I would give other people's perspectives as well. From the issue of harm none, from a Corellian point of view, our attitude has been to interpret that as avoiding unprovoked or egregious damage, and that the term harm must be understood as it would traditionally have been used, not for every imagined slight. Years ago, I remember someone telling me that they thought the Wiccan Rede prohibited hurting people's feelings in any way, to which I have to point out that our mere existence hurts the feelings of certain evangelical types who feel we shouldn't be here. We can't look at it that way and do anything. It has to have a more reasonable meaning to actually be valuable. But this is the Corellian understanding, unprovoked or egregious damage. We've always taken the point of view that a fair fight between equals is that, if everyone has chosen it. But you don't start a fight for no reason. You don't pick on people who aren't your own size, etc. The things your mother should have taught you before sending you to preschool. Don't steal Jimmy's crayons. Don't knock over the sandcastle that your neighbor has built. That's how we understand it. I've known people who who took it to far greater extremes, and that is not a point of view I can get behind, because one has to live. We're here to live. One of the things that makes the Wiccan and the Corellian religion different from many others is the idea that, no, we're meant to be here. We're meant to be having this life. And therefore, we must allow ourselves to have it. It's not an atonement. It's not a mistake. It's not inherently a terrible thing. And the idea that we're here to be as non-existent as possible is no part of that philosophy. But the idea of avoiding harm in the traditional understanding of that word is not only desirable, but I would think anyone would agree to it. It's pretty obvious. It's only when you try to make that word into something else that it becomes difficult or odious. Yeah, I remember hearing someone talk about how the Wiccan Rede meant that you had to be careful of things like deodorant for fear you'd kill microbes. That is not anything it was ever meant to cover or to be about. Francis of Assisi famously said to walk lightly on the stones because they're your brothers. And, that's a lovely thought. But I don't think the stone is really conscious of you walking on it in that way, nor is it built to be sensitive to that. It's the nature of the stone to support other things and do not take from it its purpose. So these are some of the things I would say to that. But, doing that vlog for 10 years, it was very interesting, particularly because I almost always answered off the top of my head. And in doing Rev Don's book of questions, I was at pains to try to preserve the original voice that it was answered in, even though it's not always the best voice for that sort of work. But I wanted to keep that feeling of the original vlog. And I learned in doing this how different my speaking voice can be from my writing voice. When I write, I try to cover every eventuality. I try to do that when I speak also, but of course you can't. You're speaking too quickly. You don't always think of every possible thing to mention. But when you write, you try to do that more. And my writing voice is slightly more formal than my speaking voice. Not as much as many people's, but and that also brings up an interesting question that was asked on that vlog once. I do not remember offhand who asked the question, but they asked if I had grown up being forced to speak proper English, or if I was from somewhere outside of the English-speaking world and simply learned to speak it well in the first place. And that caused some interesting looking at where my particular way of speaking comes from. And I spoke to that. You can find it on the vlog. But I came from a fairly eccentric linguistic background. A lot of different accents were involved in my upbringing and different forms of English. My mother, for example, had been taught transatlantic English. My father definitely did not speak transatlantic English. I couldn't tell you exactly what his dialect would be called. People around me spoke Midwestern English and received pronunciation English. RP English was all around me also because it was all through my parents' library and influenced in some ways how my mother spoke, and reading those books influenced how I spoke. And I have to tell you, I was an adult before I realized the different rules for British spelling versus American spelling. I'd been kind of using them simultaneously most of my life and just wondering why I was sometimes wrong. But as an adult, I did come to know the difference, but I still mix them up frequently. But now it's intentional. But as to how I speak, it was influenced by all of those things. I think everyone in their accent has unique characteristics that they don't necessarily think about. Getting me going on language is not always a good idea because language is a bit of a passion for me. And I can talk at some length about it. Oh, and that reminds me, you've heard about it, but you've never seen it. The infamous disco shirt that I sometimes talk about. This is it. Um, and so you can see it's highly patterned in the style of the late 70s. And I have kept it ever since. This is the first time I've worn it in many years. And I don't know that I'd say that it's exactly my style now, but I love this shirt from nostalgia, and thought I would wear it today. It is from 1978. And at one time I had a number of them, even though I never actually went to a disco. But I did enjoy the silky style of highly decorative shirts that was in fashion at that time. I do have, I want to say, 3 shirts still from that era that I can wear now. So you'll probably see a few more in the future, but usually I choose either solid or striped shirts. We were talking about this the other day in terms of interior decorating, that you have to be careful not to be too loud in a space you plan to live in, because that will affect the energy. And if it's too loud, it can tend to make it hard to rest and relax in the given room. And that can be true for clothing as well. And Deb says, I had one almost just like it in blue. That sounds wonderful. Very cool. I wouldn't mind seeing more of these interesting designs come back. Although I certainly do remember the 70s well enough to remember that people tended to wear too many of them at once. But that's a whole other question. In the 80s, you would still see people doing an elaborately patterned top and elaborately patterned pants at the same time, which can be a little overwhelming, depending what it is, of course. I can still remember having a pair of purple striped pants in the 70s, but I was like 10 at the time, and they were bell bottoms. I really quite liked. I quite enjoyed that era in fashion as well. I also had one of those vests with the long fringe when I was a child, and I miss. I thought that was an interesting time for fashion, and sometimes you'll see some of those elements in my artwork. But you know, every time is an interesting time for fashion. And I remember being young, and so many people would look at old photos and say, oh, we look so funny there. How could we ever have worn those clothes? And I promised myself I would not be that person, and I'm not. Because obviously you wore them because you thought they were quite nice at the time. And so I try to appreciate each period for its value. And they all have one. Now, they also all have certain outfits that weren't that great, and others that were sublime. And so a lot of the things that I follow on Instagram and Facebook have to do with fashion or architecture or artwork, because as a visual artist, these are all passions of mine. One of the things I follow is Historic Homes of America, and they were showing one today, the Loeb Mansion in Manhattan. And one of the things I've noticed is that in the late 19th century, and in houses that have been rehabilitated to look like the late 19th century, they use way too many patterns for my taste. So often I think this would be beautiful if only it were solid colored. The Loeb Mansion was an exception. It was wildly overstuffed in the manner of the late 19th century. And so many patterns on the walls, but they were Art Nouveau patterns that actually worked better than a lot that I've seen. I think what I find particularly difficult is when they rehab them in the 1980s, and some of the patterns that they've used just don't work for me. But that's my personal taste. If the people who live in that house like that, that's wonderful. But I like to have things in balance. So for example, today I'm wearing the extravagant disco shirt with a perfectly ordinary jacket and pants, which balance it all out in my opinion. Your mileage may differ, but this tends to be how I approach my artwork. Historically, I was known for including a lot of visual detail, but generally not being overwhelmed by it. Um, you can kind of tell the emotional mood I was in when I did a piece of artwork if the detail starts to overwhelm the subject matter. Um, but generally, that is not how I do it. Um, and one of the things I often talk about how when I learned things like artwork, we were in a different world versus where we are today. And because of that, I have certain skills that you might not acquire today. And one of them was how to correct a problem with your artwork by hand, because you didn't have the option of correcting it on computer. And one of the things that was not uncommon to do in the set that I traveled in, because I was first published as an artist in science fiction fandom. And they would sometimes use a very heavy outline on whatever part of the drawing they wished to emphasize. And I still use that sometimes, and it can be very effective. Not realistic, but effective. And with artwork, particularly with black and white artwork, that's what matters. And my work is pretty stylized no matter what. So um, there you go. And with that, I see that we're coming to the end of our hour. I want to remind you, if you're interested in my Patreon, you can find it at revdonlewis.com. If you are interested in the various books I talk about, corellianpublishing.com. And of course, for all of your entertainment needs, paganworld.tv and paganworld.co. And if you're interested in doing a talk show or doing some spell segments, you can contact Pagan World at paganworldtv@gmail.com or PM Ed A. Hubbard through Messenger. And with that, let us have our prayer. I want to thank you for joining me today. I love having these chats with you. I hope you're enjoying them as well. And I love the fact that we end with a prayer. I hope that you feel the same. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives. And we thank you for bringing us beauty in our lives on a daily basis. And we ask you to help us to keep our hearts open to that beauty every day and to see all of the wonderful things that are around us. Even when times are difficult, we know that beauty and wonder are still there. So help us to keep our hearts open as we go forward. And we thank you today and every day for your presence in our lives, and we know you're always with us. But from respect, we thank you for being here. And may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for being here. I love spending this time with you. I love all of you. And I hope that you're enjoying our wonderful world. And until next time, may you be blessed now and always.